Rosalie's laughter rings out, brittle as ice. Mr. Blackthorne, surely you jest. Ruth? Caleb Blackthorne, dust thick on his boots, ignores the sting. His gaze locks on Ruth, quiet in the shadows, lavender clinging to her worn dress. Ruth holds his stare, a flicker of defiance in her calm gray eyes. They both know something Rosalie doesn't. Her reign is over. This was Dust Bend, Wyoming territory, the spring of 1885, a place of wide sky and restless wind, where the cottonwoods along the creek shivered like restless hands. The town was small, its church bell carrying thin over the prairie, its people certain of what futures belonged to whom. They said the Elwoods had 2 daughters and one sure path ahead, and they said it as though repeating weather. By midday, the contrast between them was plain. Rosalie Elwood stepped from the general store with a ribbon parcel in hand, sunlight catching her hair until men straightened and women paused at their work morning. Miss Rosalie, a pair of cowhands called. She smiled bright and practiced drawing eyes without effort across town. Ruth measured grain in the barn's shadow, dust floating through the boards, her hands steady as she stacked the sacks. A boy lingered in the doorway, hat turning in his fingers. Miss Ruth, your ma says the farrier's late. She tied the sack and laid a plank across an open barrel. Then we'll keep the horses from finding the nails, she said, handing him the lighter load. Take that one, leave the heavier, for me that evening in the Elwood kitchen. Mrs. Elwood looked at her daughters the way a rancher studies 2 fields, one lush, the other plain but reliable. Ruth, sit before the stew cools. Rosalie, mind your father's chair. Rosalie spoke brightly of a church. Social. Ruth spoke of fence wire and calves slipping the gaps. Rosalie laughed lightly. You would think of wire. Ruth only stirred the pot, steam rising to her face after supper. Ruth stepped onto the stoop with a tin cup of water. The prairie stretched wide before her, the last light running off it, like a herd she could not turn behind the window. Rosalie's reflection lingered. They say a certain rancher is to be back by Sunday, she murmured, hope edging her voice. Ruth set down her cup. Then the town will have something to talk about, she answered, calm as weather later, lantern trimmed and tack hung neat. Ruth walked once more through the barn, stopping at each stall, the way some paused at pews. She rested her hand on the roan's bound leg. You'll mend, she said, her voice steady in the dark far out beyond the fence line. A rider moved against the stars, too distant to name. Dust Bend thought it knew the way stories went. The pretty sister first, the plain one after. But the prairie had its own way of remaking certainty, and by week's end, the Elwood gate would swing on a hinge not touched in years. Sunday morning broke with a hard wind carrying dust down the single street of Dust Bend. The Elwoods rode in their wagon, Ruth holding the hymnals steady on her lap, while Rosalie adjusted the ribbon in her hair at the church steps. Men tipped their hats to Rosalie first, their eyes sliding past Ruth as if she were part of the weather. Ruth followed her mother inside, calm. Unnoticed, the benches filled quickly, voices rising in hymn halfway through the service. The doors opened. A tall man entered, shoulders squared beneath a dark coat, dust clinging to his boots. Caleb Blackthorne had come home. His family's ranch stretched wider than most could ride in a day, and talk of him had carried ahead of herds driven north of men. Loyal to his word of a heart no one had yet claimed, after the sermon, neighbors gathered in the churchyard beneath the cottonwoods. Mrs. Elwood pushed Rosalie forward, her smile bright with expectation. Mr. Blackthorne, she said, surely you remember my younger daughter. Rosalie dipped her head, sunlight catching her ribbon. It's an honor to see you return, sir. But Caleb's gaze moved past her. It settled instead on Ruth, standing a step back with her hymnals pressed close. Ruth did not curtsy, nor force a smile. She only met his eyes, steady as a fence post planted deep at the tables where pies cooled and coffee poured. Caleb spoke so all could hear Mrs. Elwood. He said evenly, I'd like permission to court your elder daughter. The yard hushed. Mrs. Elwood nearly dropped her cup. Rosalie's face faltered, her practiced smile cracking a murmur, rippled through the gathering. Ruth's hands tightened on the hymnals, but her face did not change. Rosalie tried to laugh it off. You must mean me. No, ma'am. Caleb said, his voice like iron, I meant Ruth. The silence was thick enough to hear the creek running beyond the trees. Mrs. Elwood forced a smile. If that is your wish, Mr. Blackthorn. Ruth inclined her head once composed, as you say by sundown. The talk of dustbin was not the sermon nor the hymn, but the rancher who rode past the pretty sister and chose the one no cowboy wanted that evening. The wind rattled the shutters of the Elwood house. Ruth had just stacked her books on her desk when a knock came at the doorframe. Caleb Blackthorn stood there, hat in hand, rein still clinging to his coat from the ride back. His eyes carried the look of a man set on plain business. Miss Elwood, he said, might we speak a moment? Her mother's voice drifted sharp from the parlor. Don't be long, Mr. Blackthorn. Ruth followed him into the library, the air cool with the smell of old ledgers and lamp oil. Caleb set his hat on the table and spoke without flourish. I'll not pretend I didn't come looking for romance. What I need is a marriage of convenience, respect between us. Decency, no more, no less. He paused, his hand firm on the hat brim. You'll be provided for the house, the land, your future. But I require no affection. That is the truth of it. Ruth stood still, her hands folded before her eyes steady on him. The quiet stretched until the ticking of the mantel clock seemed loud. Then she said, her voice calm, if that is what you seek, I'll not stand in the way. Comfort is not a condition of marriage for the first time. His expression shifted, something faint like surprise. He gave a single nod. Good, then, we understand one another. He moved to leave, then hesitated. I'll call again tomorrow. His boots echoed once on the wood floor, then faded down the hall. Ruth remained in the lamplight, her fingers brushing the edge of a worn book. She did not smile nor sigh. She slid the volume back into its place with quiet care, closing the door behind her. With the practiced grace of a woman who had lived too long in the shadows in the weeks that followed, Caleb Blackthorn came often to the Elwood ranch. He spoke mostly with Mrs. Elwood about grazing rights and whether his words clipped and polite. Rosalie lingered near him, her laughter quick and bright. Ruth stayed at her work, content to be overlooked, as she always had been one afternoon. Caleb found her in the barn. She was bent over a saddle strap, mending with neat stitches, the late sun pouring through the slats in dusty gold. He stopped in the doorway. You mend tack yourself. Without glancing up, Ruth pulled the thread tight, better than letting it rot. He shifted his stance, boots scuffing the dirt floor. Most women wouldn't take to such work. Her eyes stayed on the leather. I prefer things that hold together. Caleb said nothing more, but his gaze lingered longer than he intended before he turned away days later. Ruth's favorite book went missing from the family library. She found it the next morning on her desk, a folded note tucked inside. The words were plain, written in his hand. You are not unremarkable. I simply failed to look correctly. She read it once, then slid the note back into the pages and said nothing. At the spring barn, dance lanterns swayed above the boards and fiddles drew couples across the yard. Rosalie drifted to Caleb, her voice soft beneath the music. You don't have to marry her, she whispered. It can still be me. Caleb's jaw tightened. I've made my choice. Across the yard, Ruth stood at the fence, the lantern glow brushing her face. She did not move, did not smile, but something shifted in her chest. Not victory, not warmth, only the quiet weight of being seen. The weeks settled into a rhythm Dust Ben could not ignore. Caleb Blackthorn kept riding up the Elwood Road, his talk with Mrs. Elwood sharp and practical, but his eyes had begun to fall elsewhere. One morning at the kitchen table, he turned to Ruth. How would you handle grazing when the pasture's near stripped? Ruth glanced at the ledger before her. Pull the cattle sooner than you'd like. Rotate them before the grass dies. Better to save the land than run it to dust. Caleb studied her silent for a beat. That sound, she closed the ledger. Nothing more said, but the next evening she found a new quill on her desk, its shaft bound with ribbon. No note, no explanation. She knew who had left it from then on. Their language became gestures. Ruth tucked a sprig of lavender into his saddlebag. Caleb placed a rare book she had once mentioned quietly on her chair when he discovered it missing later. Ruth only said books are best when shared. He inclined his head as if agreeing to something larger than words at supper one night. Rosalie broke the silence with a laugh too sharp. How dull it must be, Mr. Blackthorn, to spend your hours talking cattle and taxes with Ruth. Surely you'd rather speak of finer things. The table froze. Mrs. Elwood's hand hovered at her spoon. Caleb set his fork down, his voice steady. Not at all. I value her counsel. The room exhaled. Ruth did not thank him, did not lower her eyes. She met his gaze across the table, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them, soft, weighty, undeniable. That night when the house had quieted, Rosalie found Caleb outside beneath the moonlight. Her voice carried the edge of desperation. You don't have to go through with it. Ruth will never be enough for a man like you. No one would fault you if you chose differently. Caleb's face stayed firm. I've made my choice. Rosalie's words cut sharper. You'll regret it. She'll hold you back from the porch shadows. Ruth stepped forward, her lantern casting its light. Her voice was calm, steady as her hands. Then let me be the burden I was born to be. Rosalie's breath caught, but she turned away without answer. Caleb looked at Ruth, then not as something safe, but as something stronger than he had allowed himself to see. The storm came sudden, rolling out of the west with a wind that snapped at the cottonwoods and hammered rain against the shingles by dusk. The Elwood house was shuttered tight, lanterns burning low against the dark. Ruth stood under the front portico, holding a lantern, as the water coursed through the gravel paths. Her skirts damp at the hem through the downpour. Came bootsteps. Caleb emerged without a coat, soaked to the bone, his breath quick from the ride. He stopped beside her in the glow rain dripping from his jaw. You'll catch cold, she said. His answer was steady, so will you. The silence of the storm wrapped around them, the lantern flame bending in the wind. Ruth turned toward him, her voice calm but unflinching. Why did you choose me? Caleb's jaw worked for a long moment. The only sound was the rain. At last he spoke low, because you felt safe. I thought you'd need nothing from me. Ruth held his gaze, and now? He hesitated, then exhaled as though shedding a weight years back. I trusted a woman who promised to stay the moment I faltered. She chose another man's fortune over mine. I swore I'd never give that chance again. I thought I'd be safe with someone who asked for nothing. His eyes lifted to hers, rain striking his lashes. But now I wonder if I'm the one who needed something. All along the words hung heavy in the air. Ruth's fingers tightened on the lantern handle. She looked away first, not out of weakness, but because his eyes had grown too open too near. Later that night in the hallway outside the library, their paths crossed once more. The house was quiet, the storm receding as they passed. Their hands brushed, accidental, fleeting, but alive with something neither could deny. Caleb stopped breath, caught, but he did not turn. Ruth stood still, her heart thundering, and the silence between them stretched. Then his boots moved on his figure, fading into the dark. It was in that pause, the touch that almost became more, that Ruth understood he had begun to fear her. Not because she was dangerous, but because she had become real. The wedding came without celebration on a late summer afternoon when the heat had begun to fade, but the prairie had not yet given to autumn. No music on the street, no ribbons strung across Dust Bend. Only the white church standing plain against the prairie, and a hush that seemed to follow the couple inside. Ruth wore a calico gown, modest and carefully pressed, a veil falling to her shoulders. Caleb stood opposite, his dark coat carrying the lines of long work and long resolve. The preacher spoke the vows, his voice echoing off bare walls. Caleb's tone was steady, not tender. Ruth's was quiet, unshaken when the rings were set. There was no cheer, only the sound of wooden pews creaking as neighbors leaned to whisper outside the sky. Stretched empty, Rosalie lingered near the steps, her face pale. Her smile forced Caleb, helped Ruth into the wagon with a hand that was firm, not gentle, and drove her out to the wide land that was now theirs together. The Blackthorn Ranch house rose long and square against the prairie grass, its windows reflecting the last light of day. Inside, the rooms bore the weight of years, furniture polished, but cold ledgers stacked neatly on the desk. The air too clean, too quiet. They did not share a table that night. Ruth took her stew in the kitchen, her veil folded on the chair beside her. Caleb stayed in the study, bent over maps and papers, lamplight cutting the lines of his jaw. The silence of the house pressed, heavy footsteps echoed in halls. Two wide words stayed, short and practical. Yet in that stillness, small gestures began to appear. A cup of coffee left cooling on the porch rail. A folded note slipped beside the ledger. A walk after supper, their boots crunching the same gravel path. Words few but steps falling in rhythm. The Blackthorn house once hollow began to change. Not into warmth, not yet, but into something different, into presence, into the first quiet shape of a bond. Neither of them dared to name. Winter pressed in early, hard as iron. The mornings came rimed with frost, and the winds carried grit sharp enough to sting the eyes. One evening, Ruth retired with a shiver she could not shake by dawn. Her skin burned with fever, her breath shallow under the quilts the doctor was sent for. But Caleb never left her side. He sat by the narrow bed with a damp cloth in his calloused hand, wiping her brow when the heat surged. When her body trembled, he read from the worn Bible in his low, steady voice, the words anchoring her to the world when her breath grew ragged. He bent close, whispering her name, as though the sound itself could hold her here. "Hold on, Ruth," he murmured in the dim light. "Just hold on." Night stretched long. The lamplight guttering, the house hushed except for his voice and her strained breathing. In those hours his shoulders slumped with weariness, but he did not rise at last. One afternoon the fever broke. Pale sunlight poured across the floorboards and Ruth's eyes fluttered open. She turned her head and found Caleb still there, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, yet unmoving from his vigil. When he met her gaze, something shifted for the first time he truly looked at her. Not as the sister chosen out of duty, not as the quiet shadow of another, but as Ruth herself, alive, vulnerable. Strong in her stillness, he reached for her pillow, his hand hovering near her cheek, then stopped. His breath-tight fear flickered in his eyes. Not of her, but of what she might think if he crossed that space. He drew back, retreating into silence, as though afraid she would mistake tenderness for guilt. Ruth closed her eyes again, her breathing even at last, unaware of the storm inside him. For Caleb Blackthorn, the woman he had chosen to avoid love, had become the one he could not bear to lose by spring. The snow was gone, the ground dark with thaw. The ranch carried the sound of water running where ice had been, and Ruth's strength returned with the season. The house was no longer. Hollow mornings brought shared coffee by the window. Evenings carried the soft hush of two people reading in the same lamplight. What had begun as silence now felt like company. One night Caleb lingered in the library, the desk lamp throwing a golden circle across maps and papers. He wasn't reading, he was waiting. Ruth entered with a glass of water, her steps quiet across the rug. She set it down before him, intending to leave his hand, closed gently around her wrist. Not forceful, only certain she stilled. He rose slowly, the weariness in his eyes carrying something deeper than fatigue. Ruth, his voice was rough low. She faced him, the lamplight softening the lines of her face. "I married you out of fear," he said quietly, the words sounding heavier, "for having waited so long after she left me for another man's fortune. I told myself I'd never open that door again, so I built my life like a fortress, solid safe. Empty, I thought if I chose someone who asked for nothing, I could never lose everything." Again his eyes lifted to hers, the lamplight hard against the weariness in them. "But I see now it wasn't safety I needed. It was someone who wouldn't walk away when the walls came down, someone I could trust with all of it. The risk, the fear, the heart of it." His hand tightened at his side. "And you were never the safe choice. Ruth, you were the brave one." Ruth's hands trembled, though her voice stayed low. "I never wanted to be a duty," she said, "but I didn't want to be a wall you built either. I wanted to be the place you came home to." Caleb's gaze faltered the weight of her words, striking deeper than he'd expected. For a long moment, neither spoke, the fire crackling softly between them. Then he stepped closer, voice unsteady, but certain. "You are the distance between them, closed not with haste but with the quiet certainty of two people finally seeing each other. Without fear, by the 5th month of their marriage, silence had become ritual. They shared coffee at dawn without the need for words, Ruth's hands steady as she poured, while Caleb unfolded the paper. Evenings found them in the same room, the lamp burning low, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes speaking of small things, sometimes resting in quiet that no longer felt empty. One afternoon, the wind pressed at the eaves, carrying the smell of damp earth through the orchard. Ruth worked in the greenhouse, her hands dark with soil, arranging seedlings into neat rows. A strand of hair slipped loose across her face. Caleb stood in the doorway, his broad frame still against the light. For a moment he only watched her as if seeing something he hadn't allowed himself to look at. "Before you make this place feel alive," he said at last. She looked up. It never died. It was just waiting for someone to notice. He stepped forward slow and deliberate until the boards creaked under his boots. He reached for the strand of hair, brushing it back with his fingers. His hand lingered at her cheek, careful, reverent, as though he carried the weight of all that had gone unsaid between them. "I think I was too," he murmured. Her breath caught hope, flickered in her eyes, unsteady, dangerous, undeniable. "So was I that evening." Ruth did not sit at the far chair. She settled beside him, close enough for her skirts to brush his. Caleb turned toward her, a question clear in his gaze. Though no words rose, she answered it by setting her hand lightly atop his. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said softly, "and I'm done being afraid of myself." His chest rose with a long breath. He cupped her face with his hand, steady as stone, yet gentle as water. Then he bent and kissed her, not with duty, not with pity, but with the full weight of love discovered too late to deny. Ruth yielded not with desperation, but with relief, like a land long starved, finally tasting rain. When they parted their foreheads, leaned together. Caleb's voice was low, rough. "I should have chosen you with my heart, not my fear." Tears rimmed her eyes, her smile tender. "You did, you just didn't know it yet." The seasons turned, and with them, the shape of the Blackthorn Ranch. What had once been a house filled with silence grew into a place alive with ordinary music. The scrape of chairs at breakfast, boots on the porch, at dusk, quiet laughter, threading through the rooms like wind through tall grass. Each morning, Caleb brought Ruth a steaming cup of coffee before the day's work called him out. She tied his bandana with sure hands, her fingers brushing his jaw just long enough for him to pause in passing. They touched without thinking, his palm at her back as she moved through a doorway, her hand resting at his arm when she spoke, small gestures steady as the fence line stretching across the land in the garden. They knelt side by side, tending rows of beans and lavender. Caleb's broad frame bent to lift the heavier loads, but he watched her hands in the soil as though they steadied more than seedlings. Evenings brought them together again, books open in the lamplight, sometimes talking until words fell away, and the silence carried its own warmth. The town of dust. Ben noticed the change. Rosalie no longer carried the weight of every gaze, her ribboned beauty, fading into the background of new gossip neighbors, now spoke of Ruth Elwood, Mrs. Blackthorn, the quiet sister who had once been overlooked, but had become the woman who softened a hard rancher's heart. Some said she had shown him how to live without fear. Others said he had simply learned to see what had been there all along. One evening, as the sun bled across the prairie, Caleb and Ruth stood together on the porch. His arms settled over her shoulders, her head rested against his chest. No words were spoken, for none were needed. The horizon stretched wide and endless, but the center of their world was here, in the life they had built, steady and sure. As the turning seasons, Ben remembered the story how the rancher rode past the pretty sister and chose the one no cowboy wanted. In that choice, he found not safety but love, and in him Ruth found not duty but home.